Every person watching this video is alive because of 5 men you have never heard of. Not generals, not presidents, a pilot, an engineer, a submarine officer, a man at a radar screen. On 5 separate occasions, the world came within minutes, sometimes seconds, of total nuclear war. And each time, the only thing standing between us and the end was a single human being who made the right decision in the dark. Most of them were never thanked. Some were punished. Most died in obscurity. These are the 5 men who saved the world. In the early morning of January 24, 1961, a B-52 Stratofortress was flying a routine patrol over the eastern United States. The aircraft carried 2 thermonuclear bombs, each one a Mark 39 hydrogen bomb. Each one rated at 4 megatons. For comparison, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima was 15 kilotons. The bombs aboard this aircraft were each more than 250 times more powerful. Just after midnight, the B-52 developed a fuel leak in the right wing. The pilot, Major Walter Tulloch, was ordered to return to base. As the aircraft descended toward Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in North Carolina, the situation worsened. The wing began to fail structurally. At around 12,000 feet, the B-52 broke apart in mid-air. The crew bailed out. 5 men survived. 3 did not. The 2 hydrogen bombs separated from the disintegrating aircraft and fell toward the farmland below. The first bomb deployed its parachute, as designed. It descended slowly toward the ground near the small town of Faro, North Carolina. When it landed, it was found intact, hanging in a tree by its parachute lines. Investigators later examined the arming sequence. Of the 4 safety mechanisms designed to prevent accidental detonation, 3 had failed. Only 1 switch had prevented a 4-megaton thermonuclear explosion over the American East Coast. A single, low-voltage switch. The kind you might find in a household appliance. Years later, Parker Jones, a senior engineer at Sandia National Laboratories, who reviewed the incident, wrote a now declassified report. His conclusion, in his own words, "It was credible that the bomb could have produced a nuclear yield." The second bomb did not deploy its parachute. It hit a muddy field at terminal velocity and broke apart on impact. Parts of it were recovered. One critical component, containing weapons-grade uranium, was not. It is still there, buried somewhere under the soil of a North Carolina farm field. The Air Force purchased a permanent easement on the land. No digging is allowed. If the first bomb had detonated, the fireball would have erased Goldsboro entirely. The blast wave would have flattened structures across more than 100 square miles. Lethal radioactive fallout would have drifted across Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York, potentially exposing tens of millions of Americans. This was not Soviet aggression. This was not enemy action. This was a structural failure in an American aircraft carrying American weapons over American soil. Now, you might say a switch is not a man. And you would be right. But someone designed that switch. Someone, working at a desk somewhere, decided that a weapon this powerful needed one final barrier between an accident and a catastrophe. Someone built the last line of defense that 3 other systems had already failed to provide. We do not know his name. There is no statue, no memorial. He is not in any history book. But for one night in January 1961, The quiet work of one anonymous engineer was the only thing standing between an ordinary winter evening and the worst catastrophe in American history. He saved the world, and he never knew it. At 3 in the morning on November 9, 1979, the screens inside North American Aerospace Defense Command lit up. NORAD, buried inside Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, is the operations center responsible for detecting any nuclear attack on the United States or Canada. On that night, the system reported a massive Soviet first strike. 2,200 Soviet missiles, launched from submarines and silos, heading toward North America. A full-scale nuclear attack. The duty officers had between 6 and 26 minutes to confirm the launch before American retaliation became inevitable. The protocol was clear. Wake the president, launch the bombers, prepare the silos, begin the response. The bombers were scrambled. Intercontinental ballistic missile crews were brought to launch readiness. Air traffic control was alerted to clear airspace for emergency military flights. The Airborne Command Post, the aircraft designed to carry senior officers in the event of nuclear war, took off from Andrews Air Force Base. The president was not yet awake. In the next several minutes, NORAD officers attempted to confirm the attack using independent radar systems. Early warning satellites looking for the heat plumes of Soviet missiles in flight. They found nothing. The radars showed empty sky. The satellites showed no launches. There were no missiles. But the computers continued to insist that 2,200 warheads were inbound. Somewhere in the system, somebody had loaded a training tape. A simulation, a drill scenario designed to test the response of NORAD personnel. It had been fed into the live early warning system by mistake, and the computers had no way to distinguish it from real data. Here is the part that matters. The machines said war. The protocol said respond. Everything in that command center was pushing toward one outcome: launch. And someone in that room looked at the empty radar screens, looked at the screaming computers, and made a choice. He trusted the sensors that showed nothing over the system that said the world was ending. The launch order was never given. Aircraft returned to base. Missile crews stood down. The incident was classified for years. When it was eventually revealed, the explanation was framed as a minor technical issue. It was not minor. For roughly 6 minutes on a November morning, the United States military had been preparing to launch a full nuclear retaliation against the Soviet Union, based on a training exercise that someone had loaded into the wrong machine. The officer who stopped it has never been publicly named. There is no record of a commendation, no award, no statue. He went home in the morning. He had breakfast. And somewhere in Moscow, the Soviet leadership had no idea how close they had come. The Cold War had been over for 4 years. The Soviet Union no longer existed. The Berlin Wall was a memory. American and Russian leaders shook hands and signed treaties. The world had moved on. In January 1995, a team of Norwegian and American scientists prepared to launch a research rocket from the Andøya Space Center on the northern coast of Norway. The rocket, a black Brant 12, was designed to study the aurora borealis, the northern lights, a scientific instrument. In accordance with international protocol, Norway notified 30 countries about the launch in advance, including Russia. The notification was sent. It was received. And somewhere in the Russian military bureaucracy, it was filed and forgotten. On January 25th, at exactly 7:24 in the morning, the rocket launched. Russian early warning radars detected it immediately. The Black Brant 12 was a 4-stage research rocket. Its size, speed, and trajectory closely resembled a Trident submarine-launched ballistic missile, fired from an American submarine in the Norwegian Sea. From the Russian perspective, the radar return looked nearly identical, and it was heading toward Russian airspace. Russian military doctrine at the time identified a single warhead, high-altitude detonation over Moscow as a possible American first strike scenario. The theory was straightforward. One warhead detonates in the upper atmosphere. The electromagnetic pulse disables Russian command and control. Then, the real attack arrives. The Norwegian rocket fit that profile. Within minutes, the alarm reached the highest levels of the Russian government. For the first, and so far only time in history, the Russian nuclear briefcase, the Cheget, was activated. Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Federation, was woken in the middle of the night. The briefcase was opened in front of him. He had minutes to decide whether to authorize a Russian nuclear response against the United States. The retaliation plan was already loaded. What happened next is still debated. Later accounts disagree on the exact sequence and timing, but the central facts are not disputed. Somewhere in the Russian early warning system, radar operators kept tracking the rocket. And as it climbed, one thing became clear to the men watching the screens. It was not heading for Moscow. It was arcing north and east, over the Barents Sea, into the upper atmosphere, away from everything. Those operators made the call. They reported it as what it was, not an attack. By 8 minutes after launch, the rocket had separated from its payload and fallen back to Earth, exactly as planned. Yeltsin did not authorize the strike. The Norwegian scientists, unaware of what had nearly happened, collected their data on the Northern Lights and went home. The incident was not publicly disclosed for years. When it finally was, the explanation focused on bureaucracy. A piece of paper had been mishandled. A notification had not been passed up the chain. The radar officers who read the trajectory correctly have never been named. Neither has the staff who reached Yeltsin in time. They are anonymous, as they always are. The Cold War was over, officially. But on a January morning in 1995, the world came as close to nuclear annihilation as it had at any point in the previous 40 years, over a rocket designed to study lights in the sky. And once again, it was ordinary men watching screens who chose correctly. October 27, 1962, the 13th day of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the most dangerous day in human history. In the Caribbean, the United States Navy was enforcing a blockade around Cuba. American destroyers and aircraft were tracking anything that moved underwater, searching for Soviet submarines. They found one. The B-59 was a Foxtrot-class diesel-electric submarine. She had departed northern Russia weeks earlier, ordered to a position off the Cuban coast as part of a covert Soviet deployment. American intelligence did not yet know what made her different from other Soviet submarines. She was carrying a nuclear torpedo, a 10-kiloton weapon, roughly 2/3 the yield of the Hiroshima bomb, designed to be launched at an American carrier group from underwater. Authorization to use it required the consent of 3 officers on board: the captain, the political officer, and the chief of staff of the submarine flotilla. The American destroyer USS Beale began dropping practice depth charges around the B-59, small explosives intended to signal the submarine to surface and identify itself. The Soviets did not know they were practice charges. From inside the hull, they sounded like a depth charge attack. The B-59 had been submerged for days. Communications with Moscow had been cut off for nearly 2 weeks. The temperature inside the hull had climbed past 50 degrees Celsius. Carbon dioxide levels had risen to dangerous levels. Crew members were collapsing. Some had lost consciousness. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, was convinced that war had already started. He had no way to confirm or deny it. The Americans were attacking. The radio was silent. The boat was dying around him. He ordered the nuclear torpedo prepared for launch. His words, as later recorded by a witness on board, were that they would attack now. That they would die, but the Americans would die too. That they would not disgrace the Navy. Later accounts disagree on the precise wording, but the intent is not in dispute. The political officer agreed. 2 of the 3 required authorizations were in place. The third was Vasily Arkhipov. Arkhipov was the chief of staff of the entire submarine flotilla, who happened to be aboard the B-59. He was 36 years old. He had previously served on the K-19, a Soviet ballistic missile submarine that had suffered a reactor accident the year before. He had stayed behind to lead the repair effort. He had been exposed to lethal levels of radiation. He had watched men die from radiation sickness in front of him. He knew exactly what a nuclear weapon did. When the captain ordered the torpedo prepared, Arkhipov refused to authorize the launch. What followed was an argument. In the dark, in the heat, with carbon dioxide thick enough that men were passing out, with practice depth charges exploding around the hull. With 3 officers, the only 3 people in the world who could give that order, arguing about whether to start a nuclear war. Arkhipov held his position. He insisted that without confirmed contact from Moscow, they could not assume war had begun. He demanded they surface and try to communicate. He stood his ground against the captain and the political officer both. Eventually, they relented. The B-59 surfaced. The crew identified the submarine to the American destroyers. Communications were reestablished. War had not begun. The submarine returned to the Soviet Union. When they arrived, the crew was not welcomed home. They were treated with suspicion for having surfaced. Arkhipov's reputation suffered for years. He continued to serve in the Navy. He died in 1998. He told the story only to his family. His role was not publicly known until 2002. If he had agreed with the captain, if he had said yes instead of no, the nuclear torpedo would have been fired into the American carrier group. The American response, under the rules of engagement at the time, would have been a nuclear strike on Cuba. The Soviet response to that would have been a strategic strike on the United States and Western Europe. Hundreds of millions of people would have died within hours. Nuclear war was prevented that day by one man's refusal to vote yes. His name was Vasily Arkhipov. In September 1983, the world was the closest it had been to nuclear war since 1962. 3 weeks earlier, the Soviet Union had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, a civilian airliner that had strayed into Soviet airspace. 269 people had died. The Americans were furious. The Soviets were defensive. Tensions were the highest they had been in 20 years. Inside the Soviet early warning system, the atmosphere was tense. Orders had been issued to be ready, to trust the system, to respond to any sign of American attack without hesitation. Stanislav Petrov was a 44-year-old lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces. On the night of September 26th, he was the duty officer at Serpukhov 15, the command center for the Soviet satellite early warning system. His job was to monitor the satellites that watched American missile fields and to immediately report any launch to his superiors. Just after midnight, Moscow time, the alarm went off. The system reported one American intercontinental ballistic missile, launched from a base in the United States, heading toward Soviet territory. The protocol was simple: confirm the launch, report up the chain. Soviet retaliation would follow within minutes. Petrov hesitated. Something did not feel right. If the Americans were starting a nuclear war, they would not launch one missile. They would launch hundreds. A massive first strike designed to overwhelm Soviet defenses before any retaliation could be organized. One missile made no strategic sense. He waited. He requested verification from ground-based radar. The radar showed nothing. But ground radar could not see over the horizon. It could only detect missiles in the final stages of flight. By the time it confirmed anything, retaliation would be too late. He had to decide. He reported the alert as a false alarm. Minutes later, the alarm sounded again. A second missile, then a third, then a fourth, then a fifth. 5 American missiles, the system insisted, were now in flight. A first strike was underway. The pressure on Petrov was immense. The officers around him were staring. The lights were flashing red. The siren was screaming. His superiors had to be informed. The Soviet response had to begin. He reported it as a false alarm again. He could not prove it. He had no evidence other than his instinct that the system was wrong. He had been trained as an engineer. He understood that satellites made mistakes. He understood that machines could lie. He chose to trust his own judgment over the machine. And then he waited. If he was wrong, the American missiles would reach Soviet territory within 15 minutes. He would have failed in his duty. The Soviet Union would be destroyed before it could respond. The minutes passed. Nothing arrived. No missiles, no explosions, no war. Investigation later determined the cause. The Soviet satellite had detected sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds above American missile fields and interpreted the reflections as missile launches. A combination of rare orbital geometry, atmospheric conditions, and a flaw in the detection algorithm had produced a perfect false positive. The system had worked exactly as designed. The design was wrong. If Petrov had followed protocol, if he had reported the launches as real, Soviet retaliation would have begun within minutes. The American counterstrike would have followed. The world, as it existed in September 1983, would have ended that night. Petrov did not receive a medal. He was not commended. He was reprimanded for failing to fill out the incident logbook properly during the alert. The military found it embarrassing that the system had failed and preferred not to discuss it. He was quietly transferred to a less sensitive post. He retired in 1984. He lived in a small apartment outside Moscow. He worked for a time as a security guard. His role was unknown to the world. The story only emerged in the 1990s after the Soviet Union collapsed. Western journalists tracked him down. he was reluctant to talk. When he did, he refused to call himself a hero. He said he had only been doing his job. He died in 2017. Most people on Earth have never heard his name. But on a September night in 1983, alone in a bunker buried in the Russian countryside, one man looked at every alarm he had been trained to obey and decided not to believe them. And every person watching this video is alive because of it. The Cold War ended without nuclear war. History records this as a triumph of diplomacy, of deterrence, of careful statesmen managing a careful balance. It was not. It was a switch in a falling bomb, a radar operator who trusted his eyes over his computer, a handful of men who read a trajectory correctly, a submarine officer who refused to vote yes, a duty officer who chose not to believe what the system told him. 5 moments, 5 decisions made in the dark by men whose names were never meant to be remembered. There were almost certainly others, incidents we will never know about, decisions made in command centers and silos and submarines whose records are still classified, or were never written down at all. The world did not survive the Cold War because of policy. It survived because of people. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this one, consider subscribing. It genuinely means a lot. Until next time.